15 years after Citizens United, lawmakers across the country are trying a brand new strategy to limit corporate election spending, and it's getting legally creative. Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, the podcast where we take the headlines about legislation and dig into the bills themselves, because the real story is usually hiding somewhere between Section 3 and the Enforcement Clause.
Yes, and of course that's the part that most people skip. You should never skip the Enforcement Clause. But today's episode is proof that sometimes the driest looking legislative language can have the biggest political implications.
Exactly, because today we are talking about one of the most controversial Supreme Court decisions in modern politics: Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission.
Yes, the decision that launched about 15 years of arguments involving the word corporation, free speech and campaign finance, usually at a volume that makes Thanksgiving dinner pretty awkward.
You know, they have Helena Troy with the ships and they have Citizens United with the fighting.
Absolutely.
But here's what makes 2026 super interesting. The outrage about Citizens United isn't new. It is, again, something that is ever present at a Thanksgiving dinner table. But what is new here is the strategy that lawmakers are trying.
Yes, instead of trying to pass campaign finance laws that courts might strike down under Citizens United, a growing group of states are trying something that's a little bit sneakier.
We love this sneaky legislation. They are rewriting the legal powers of corporations themselves. So at the top here, let's talk a little bit about how this can look different in the US versus the UK. Because as far as I understand, the UK also has something going on where they also see corporations as people, which is essentially what Citizens United is all about, codifying that corporations can be treated like human beings.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the effect in the US then is therefore that they have freedom of speech. Now, of course, we don't have freedom of speech in the UK, as every right-winger and President Trump in particular and Elon Musk would certainly affirm. So I have to be a little bit careful about what I say here, I might get arrested. We do have this concept of legal personhood. So a company is a sort of a legal entity in its own right. But the implications on campaign financing simply don't arise. So the negative effects of Citizens United, we just don't get in the UK. Now, I wouldn't say that our electoral system in the UK is perfect by any means. It's in a lot of ways terribly broken as well, just as the US one is. But this is one respect where I think we probably get it pretty right. So there is actually no prohibition in the UK on companies donating to campaigns. So we don't have those kinds of limits and rules and things like that. But instead, what we do have is statutory campaign spending limits. So it doesn't matter how much companies are actually donating towards campaigns because the campaign can't spend that money. Now, the rules around campaign spending limits during elections are notoriously complex, nuanced, lots of different variations for different types of people. So every candidate who stands in an election has to have an agent, and the agent's job is to interpret these rules and make sure that keep all the receipts for everything, the bus journey here and those posters you printed there, keep it all together to make sure you're not going over the limit. And then if there are investigations afterwards, which there always are, then they can result in like fines and censures and things. So you would never actually overturn an election result because someone spent too much money, because it is generally an honest mistake when they do it. It's very rare that you see people going out. But just to give you an idea of how it works, broadly speaking, in a national campaign, general election, one of the big parties are allowed to spend about £35 million on the election per party. And an individual candidate in a constituency is fighting for their constituency, say again in the general election, is allowed to spend about £20,000.
Okay.
So if you compare that to the amount, and we'll talk about the numbers in the US a little bit, you're going to see it's a pale fraction of the amount of money that goes into US elections. But what that means is that our election campaigning is very different. So an election campaign really officially only runs for 2 weeks. Obviously, once you know an election's coming, then it does go on a lot before that. But the actual official period is only 2 weeks. You don't have adverts on TV from political parties. It just doesn't happen. What you get is the national parties will put out the odd little sort of adverts, generally called party political broadcasts. So they each prepare a set limit. They have a certain amount of time, and then the TV channels will all show them one after another on different days. So Wednesday it's the Labour Party, and Tuesday it's the Conservative Party. At the same time, there's very strict rules about how that all works, which in contrast to the US, I remember being in Colorado during, I think it was Obama's second election victory, when Colorado was a swing state. It was
Yeah.
still very purple at the time. And oh my God, the amount of adverts on TV was just
Yeah.
ludicrous. And they were terrible as well. These awful, horrible, aggressive, unpleasant ads that people put out. And you just don't get that so much. Even though people have said in recent years our politics are moving in that direction, but it's nowhere near as bad as that.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was last summer, I can't even remember at this point, but when Kirst Armour was elected, and you were saying that the entire process was about 6 weeks start to finish, and then y'all
Yeah.
just get to go back to living your lives and not thinking about
Mm.
who's going to be the next PM and this, that, the other.
Yeah.
And we are like in the trenches right now of trying to figure out
Yeah.
who's going to be running in the next election. There's all these people
I
doing
know.
all these kind of exploratory podcasts where, someone will be like, so are you running? You're not saying you're running, this, that, the other. And the candidates who aren't candidates
Yeah.
are, I'm not this, but I'm floating some, and it's,
Yes.
it
Yes.
never ends here because of all
It's
that
not, I
money.
I mean, unfortunately, it is a little bit like that here now as well, and largely because the Labour Party were elected with a huge majority just less than 2 years ago, and then they instantly collapsed. And so over the last 2 years, their popularity has plummeted. They're now like running fourth in the polls, and the sort of quite extreme populist parties are way, way above them, and it looks like they could win the next election. So we are constantly talking about it here as well. And we've got local elections coming up in May that are seen as a real sort of barometer. It's a bit like the midterms, seen as a
Yeah.
barometer. They're local elections, but the Labour Party are going to get absolutely crucified in these local elections, and we're going to see these Reform Party and the Green Party, oddly enough, which has become this major populist left-wing player, will be taking lots and lots of these sort of the local council seats. So we are in that. It didn't used to be like that. It used to be that every 4 years there'd be this Ferrari, and then it'd be relatively quiet. But now we do seem to be in perma campaign mode as well here, which is sort of quite unpleasant. But it is just because politics have become so volatile, much more so than in the US, where actually changes are quite small. Even if you swing from the Republicans to the Democrats and then back again, those swings are actually quite small. Here it's just wild. Like parties are going up 30-40% up and
Yeah,
down,
that's
30
pretty
40%
crazy.
in their votes. No one knows who to vote for, and people are just going for all sorts of different parties because we have more choice. That's one of the effects you get with more choice.
It's a coalition government, baby. Well, I'd
Hmm.
say this is a perfect primer to talk about the absolute chaos that today's episode
Yes.
is about.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we are talking about money in politics, and we have problems certainly in the UK with money in politics. As I say, because people are allowed to spend less money, our campaigns are quite quaint. They have to be more creative, I find, in terms of how they go out to get your vote. So in the last election, the Liberal Democrat Party was really struggling to get traction, and they couldn't just blanket adverts everywhere and spend lots of money. So instead, their leader decided to just do a stunt every day to get himself on TV. So every single day, the leader of a major political party he'd be windsurfing, and he'd fall off, and he'd go down some slide and fall off, and he was generally falling into water and making himself look completely ridiculous just to try and attract attention. And everyone was like, that just makes you look ridiculous. He says, yeah, but then I get to talk about my policies. They interview me about, falling off this thing, but then I get to talk about my policies and I get on TV, which I wouldn't otherwise. And it worked. I mean, they did very well. So,
I'm kind of
what are
seeing
you
how
doing when you
Eddie
don't have the
the
money to
Eagle was
spend?
able to get to the Olympics with the ideas that you all have going on there about how to campaign for yourselves.
Look it up. Look up some of Ed Davies stunts. I'm sure they're all on YouTube because he's a funny looking bloke to start with, and then him just being ridiculous in the election. But somehow it endeared him to people. It was a very Eddie the Eagle type thing, I think. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's get into talking about these bills. Let's start then by looking at a fascinating legal question that's at the heart of this. If corporations only exist because states grant them charters, can states also define what those corporations are allowed to do, including whether they can spend money influencing elections?
That theory is at the center of a wave of legislation across the country, including California's AB 1984, which may be the most ambitious example so far.
Yes, yes, and I think people who object to this, of course, may well say that 1984 is appropriate. But if you want to follow these bills across all 50 states, it's exactly the kind of thing that Bill Track 50 was built for. Because when policy experiments start popping up simultaneously in dozens of legislatures, you need a good tracking map.
Yes, which is what we'll definitely get into today. But first, Stephen, let's rewind just a tiny bit. For anyone who remembers the controversy, but maybe not the details, what all exactly did the Supreme Court decide in Citizens United?
Okay, well, it was back in 2010, and the court ruled that the government generally cannot ban independent political spending by corporations or unions. And the reasoning was that political spending counts as protected speech under the First Amendment because, of course, as we've said, companies are people, and so therefore their speech is protected in the same way as any citizen would be.
And the key word there is independent, right?
Yes, yes. So this is again one of those classic little Supreme Court quirks, and that they dug into the legal stuff that no one else could possibly understand, and figured out that it doesn't work to legalize direct corporate contributions to candidates. Those are still banned under federal law, but corporations and unions, in fact, are allowed to spend money independently. So, for example, on political ads that support or oppose candidates.
Okay, which helped fuel the rise of super PACs and outside spending groups.
So yeah, things were going that way anyway, but this decision really sort of supercharged and opened the door wider for this modern ecosystem of political spending, whereas now a vast majority of the money spent on elections is spent by these super PACs, outside spending groups.
Okay, so let's talk numbers here, because this is where the scale of change really becomes clear.
Yes, that's right. So if you want to track this, you can go to Open Secrets. They track all of this political spending, and they do it very well. And they've tracked the growth in political spending since 2010. So outside spending in federal elections was about $494 million in 2010, which is a lot of money. A lot of money, $500 million. But by 2012, it had jumped to $1.28 billion.
2012, so 2 years?
Yes, 2 years.
It
2
just
years.
kept going after
more
that?
than double. Yes, and it just kept going, exactly. By 2020, it had reached 2.95 billion. And then 2020, and then by 2024, just 4 years later, it was at $4.46 billion. So this is crazy, crazy amounts of money that's being spent.
You know, I am starting to see where maybe some of our wages are going. So that's a nearly tenfold increase from where it started. That is crazy.
It is. It's nuts. And a large share of that spending comes from organizations that don't fully disclose their donors because they don't have to.
Well, that's where the phrase dark money enters the conversation, right?
Yes, absolutely, which is a great term, very sinister. But Citizens United protects corporate political spending.
If Citizens United protects corporate political spending, how are states trying to regulate it now?
Well, they're shifting the legal battlefield. Instead of regulating speech, these bills try to regulate corporate powers.
In other words, if a corporation is a state-created entity, maybe the state can define what activities that entity is allowed to engage in.
Exactly. That's the theory behind what some advocates are calling the corporate powers reset.
All right, let's talk about this centerpiece bill, California AB 1984. What does this bill actually do?
Well, it has three major components. So first of all, it revokes corporate powers that aren't explicitly granted under Californian law. Secondly, it states that election-related activity is not among those powers.
Meaning corporations would not have legal authority to spend money influencing elections.
Correct. And thirdly, it enforces the rule by treating violations as ultra vires, a legal term meaning an action beyond the authority of the corporation.
Which sounds pretty technical, but has really serious consequences.
Yes, exactly. So if a corporation violates the rule, it could risk losing charter privileges, including things like limited liability protections.
But legislation isn't the only approach that's happening in this space.
No. So something that's been attracting quite a lot of attention. In Montana, you have reform advocates pursuing a ballot initiative strategy, which is known as the Montana Plan. The idea here is to amend corporate charters through a constitutional initiative that limits election spending.
But that effort ran into trouble earlier this year.
Yes, unsurprisingly, it's running into legal problems. So on January the 6th, 2026, the Montana Supreme Court blocked the initial ballot language. The court ruled that the proposal violated the state's separate vote rule, which means a ballot initiative can't bundle multiple constitutional changes together. So it's a bit of a technicality.
I was going to say, it sounds like a flag on the play. Even getting the proposal onto the ballot has turned into a legal fight here. And Montana and California are not alone.
No, not even close. In 2026, there were about 35 bills across multiple states which are experimenting with similar ideas. And if you look at the blog post on Bill Track 50, you can open up a map there and you can see all the proposals across states, including Georgia, Maryland, Minnesota, Missouri, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Virginia.
And these bills fall into a few main strategies.
Yes, that's right. So there's three major strategies, really. So first are statutory corporate power resets bills, a little bit like California's. Secondly, there are state constitutional amendments that try to embed limits on corporate political spending directly into state constitutions. And thirdly, you have resolutions urging a federal constitutional amendment, which would just overturn Citizens United entirely.
I wonder what kind of world that would be. One thing that stands out here in this legislation wave is the partisan breakdown.
Yes, at the moment, these proposals are overwhelmingly introduced by Democrats. In fact, if you look at all the bills, there is not a single Republican name on any of these bills at all.
Wow. I would say that was surprising, but it's really not, because it reflects how Citizens United has really become this partisan policy issue.
Yes, exactly. And Democrat lawmakers do tend to frame the decision as a threat to democratic accountability. And Republican leadership generally prioritizes First Amendment concerns. You can understand that. But if you think about it, the Republicans moan about all the money that Democrats spend on elections, just the same way the Democrats moan about Republicans. So there's no real reason why this should be a partisan issue in the way it is, but it just has become that.
Yeah, I think it's also like who is donating the money, and I think that's kind of the biggest problems from both sides is I don't want this person getting money from that, or whatever. So
yeah. But both parties do it. I mean, there's a few individuals who say I don't take big money, but the vast majority of the money in politics on both sides, it comes from it. You can't just say the Republicans are terrible and the Democrats are saints here. No way. I mean, it's the dark money and the big money is on both sides.
Right, and it's almost the exact same thing.
Yes, tends to be the same people donated to both parties, which is insane if you think about it as well, isn't it?
If you got enough money to play all the sides, why not? Okay, so realistically, what happens next with these bills?
Well, the short answer is courts. That's, of course, if they pass at all. And some of these bills may pass in states with Democratic majorities, but almost any meaningful corporate spending restrictions will inevitably trigger litigation that will make its way through the courts and probably end up back at the Supreme Court.
They are going to be busy, busy, busy.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of the strategy. If enough states test these ideas, the courts will eventually have to decide whether regulating corporate power is fundamentally different from regulating political speech. So you could see this very much as like the first wave. It's like, let's get some of this stuff before the courts. Let's get some legal decisions on this, a bit of precedent, and see whether it's actually worth pursuing.
Yeah, and with the midterms coming up and people kind of tuning back into politics, we're about to go into that 2-year crazy sprint until we have a new president. Yep. If you want to track any of these bills or bills that are yet to be proposed, because this definitely is an emerging trend, you can see bills that move or stall, which might be more common in some of these places across the country using Bill Track 50. And like we said, we have a great blog post with this that has an interactive map. You can see if your state is proposing any, because it's definitely an interesting thing to be checking out.
Absolutely, because as this episode shows, the next big battle over campaign finance might not start in Congress or, in fact, the Supreme Court. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, let us know your opinions on Citizen United and anything else that we spoke about today.
And remember, some bills tweak the systems, others rewrite the operating manual for corporations and elections, but they all deserve a look-see beyond that bill number.